What if a dog became a hero in the most unexpected way? This isn't just a story about a lost kitten. It's about a rescue dog who made a choice, one that changed both their lives forever. A stray dog, alone in the world, was searching for food. Just another day of survival. But then, he stopped. Something caught his attention. A tiny kitten, shivering and helpless, barely clinging to life. Abandoned, forgotten. The dog could have ignored her, walked away. But he didn't. What he did next? No one saw coming. The stray dog had no name, no collar, no home. Every day was a battle for survival. He wandered the streets, searching for food. Sometimes he found scraps. Other times, nothing. His ribs showed through his thin fur. His paws ached from walking miles with no rest. People passed him by. Some looked at him with pity. Others ignored him completely. He was just another stray, forgotten by the world. But today was different. As he sniffed along an alley, hoping for something to eat, he stopped. His ears perked up. Something was there. A faint sound. A tiny cry. He followed it. Behind an old broken fence, tucked between piles of leaves, was a tiny ball of fur. It was barely moving, shaking, weak. A kitten. She was smaller than his paw, her eyes barely open. She let out a soft, helpless meow. It was almost too quiet to hear. The dog tilted his head. He had seen many things in the streets, other dogs, angry people, even danger. But this was different. He took a step closer, sniffed the air. She smelled of dirt and loneliness. Just like him. He could have walked away. He should have. That's what the streets had taught him. Look out for yourself, or no one else will. But he didn't. Instead, he lay down beside her. He curled his body around her tiny frame, blocking the wind. His own stomach growled, but he ignored it. The kitten needed warmth more than he needed food. She pressed against him, her tiny heartbeat faint but steady. The dog didn't know why, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. The kitten was alone. She had no mother, no siblings, no warm place to hide. Just the cold ground beneath her and the rough world around her. Her tiny body shivered. Her fur was dirty and thin, barely enough to keep her warm. She tried to move, but was too weak. Hunger had drained her strength. Days without food had made her small frame even smaller. She let out a tiny cry, a desperate call for help. But no one answered. The streets were loud. Cars rushed by. People walked past, too busy to notice the little life struggling to survive. Her breathing was slow. Her heartbeat even slower. She didn't understand what was happening. All she knew was the hunger, the cold, and the darkness creeping in. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. She saw shadows, a blurry world. Everything felt too big, too scary. She curled up tighter, trying to keep warm. But the wind was too strong, and her body was too weak. Another soft meow escaped her lips, quieter this time. She was running out of time. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, coming closer, stopping. A warm breath brushed against her tiny face. A large nose sniffed her fur. She felt something beside her. Not cold, but warm. Not rough, but soft. The kitten didn't know what it was, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. The dog stood still. He watched the tiny kitten struggle to breathe. She was so small, so fragile. He could have walked away. That's what the streets had taught him. Keep moving. Stay alive. No one helped him when he was alone. Most animals wouldn't stop. Most wouldn't care. But he did. Something deep inside him refused to leave. He lowered his body, curling around the kitten. His fur wasn't much, but it was warmer than the cold air biting at her tiny frame. She pressed against him, her weak body barely moving. Her breathing was slow, too slow. The dog licked her gently. Her fur tasted of dust and sadness, but he didn't stop. He nudged her with his nose, trying to keep her awake, trying to keep her here. He didn't know why, but something told him she needed him. And maybe he needed her too. The night crept in. The air grew colder. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten. But food didn't matter right now. Only she did. Every few moments he licked her again, his warmth the only thing keeping her safe. The streets were dangerous. He knew that better than anyone. He had fought for food, for shelter, for survival. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was a choice. And he had already made it. He wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. The sun disappeared. The streets turned dark. Cold air crept in, wrapping around the city like a silent shadow. The night was unforgiving, but the dog didn't move. He curled tighter around the tiny kitten. His body was the only shield she had. She shivered against him, her breath faint but steady. She was still here, still fighting. The dog licked her again, gently brushing away the dust and dirt from her fur. His tongue was rough, but his touch was careful. He had no idea why he was doing it, only that it felt right. Hunger twisted inside him, a deep ache he had learned to ignore. He was used to it. Hunger was nothing new. But this? Protecting something so small? That was new. The kitten let out a soft meow, barely more than a whisper. The dog's ears perked up. He lowered his head, pressing his nose to hers. She wasn't alone anymore. The night stretched on. Strange sounds filled the empty streets. Distant voices, the hum of cars, the rustling of the wind. But the dog didn't flinch. He stayed still, guarding her. Every so often, he adjusted his position, making sure she was covered, making sure she was warm. The kitten moved slightly, pressing closer. Her tiny body relaxed for the first time. She trusted him. The dog rested his head beside her, his tired eyes watching the darkness. He had spent his whole life surviving. But this wasn't just survival. This was something more. And he wasn't giving up now. Morning came slowly. The streets were still empty, the air still cold. But the dog hadn't moved. He was tired, hungry, but he stayed. The kitten stirred beside him. Her tiny body was still weak, but she was warm. She was alive. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Someone was coming. A stranger. They walked past at first, not noticing the dog curled up against the fence. But then they stopped. Something made them look back. A stray dog wasn't unusual. The city had many. But this was different. He wasn't alone. The person stepped closer, their eyes widening. A kitten. A tiny, helpless kitten pressed against the dog's side. The dog lifted his head. His eyes met the stranger's. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just looked at them. It wasn't a look of fear or anger. It was a silent plea. The person knelt down, watching. The dog didn't move away. He didn't run. He just stayed. The stranger could see it, the determination in his eyes, the way he had wrapped himself around the kitten. He had been protecting her, keeping her alive. But he couldn't do it alone. The stranger knew the kitten wouldn't last much longer. She needed food. She needed care. And the dog? He needed help too. Slowly, carefully, the person reached out. The dog tensed, but didn't back away. He watched as the hands gently lifted the kitten. She was so small, so fragile. But she let out a tiny meow. The dog's ears perked up. He stood, ready to follow. The stranger smiled. They weren't just saving the kitten. They were saving them both. The warmth was new. So was the quiet. For the first time in a long time, the dog wasn't outside, searching for food. He wasn't curled up on the cold ground, waiting for the night to pass. He was inside. The air smelled different, clean, safe. A soft blanket lay beneath him, warmer than anything he had ever known. But he wasn't thinking about himself. His eyes stayed on the kitten. She was wrapped in a small towel, her tiny body resting in gentle hands. She wasn't shivering anymore. Her breaths were steady. She was safe. The dog didn't take his eyes off her, not even when a bowl of food was placed in front of him. He was starving, but he waited. The kitten moved slightly. Her little nose twitched. Then, for the first time, she let out a tiny purr. The sound was soft, barely there, but it was enough. The dog's tail wagged, just a little. He lowered his head, sniffing her once more, making sure she was real, making sure she was okay. A gentle hand stroked his fur. The stranger, no, the rescuer, was watching him too. "You did good, buddy," they whispered. The dog didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. For the first time, he wasn't alone. Neither was she. The kitten opened her eyes, weak but bright. She looked up at the dog, recognizing the warmth, the scent. She stretched her tiny paw out, resting it against his leg. The dog lay down beside her, his body relaxed. The fight was over. The streets were behind them. This was home. And this was just the beginning. Days passed. Then, weeks. The tiny, weak kitten grew stronger. Her legs wobbled at first, but soon she was running, playing, exploring her new world. But no matter where she went, the dog was always close behind. He watched her with careful eyes, never letting her stray too far. If she tumbled, he nudged her back up. If she got tired, he curled around her, letting her rest in his warmth. She had been alone once. So had he. But not anymore. The dog, once a starving stray, now had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving. He was protecting. His instincts had told him to save her. Now they told him to stay by her side. The kitten adored him. She climbed onto his back, curled up beside him, batted at his tail playfully. He let her. She was small, but she was fearless, because she knew he was there. Their bond was unbreakable, and soon their story spread. People couldn't believe it. A stray dog saving a helpless kitten, refusing to leave her side. Pictures were shared, videos were watched, hearts were touched. Some called him a hero, others called it a miracle. But to them, it was simple. She had needed him, and he had needed her. Now, they had each other, forever. Ask for anything in return. It just happens. A stray dog had nothing, no home, no family, no reason to stop. But he did. He chose kindness when he could have walked away. And that choice changed everything. The kitten was small, fragile, and helpless. She had no chance on her own. But the dog didn't see her as a burden. He saw her as something worth protecting. His warmth kept her alive. His presence made her safe. His love gave her a future. They came from different worlds, one a lonely stray, the other an abandoned baby. But together, they became something more, a family. Their story teaches us something powerful. Kindness isn't about who you are or what you have. It's about what you do. Even in the darkest moments, a simple act of love can bring light. Even when life is hard, compassion makes a difference. And sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They walk on four legs. They wag their tails. And they remind us that love is everywhere. We just have to see it.